Hello, my name's Louise Horton and I'm a PhD student at Birkbeck, University of London. And in this video, celebrating 300 years since the birth of Gilbert White, I'm going to explore the life and library of Molly White, the woman who helped research and edit his best-selling book. For over 2 centuries, Gilbert White's book has inspired generations of readers. First published in 1789, The Natural History of Selborne is now one of the most printed books in the English language, as every year new audiences find themselves immersed in the landscape of 18th century rural Hampshire. Celebrated as the father of ecology, Gilbert created a new kind of natural history writing. But he didn't do it alone. He was part of a cultural ecosystem that stretched from the village of Selborne to the printing presses of London's Fleet Street and beyond. Yet the story of that ecosystem is barely known. So in the tercentenary of Gilbert's birth, I'm going to map the cultural landscape that nurtured his book to recover and explore the remarkable life of his niece Molly, the woman who helped bring Selborne to life. And to find her, we're going to turn the pages of Gilbert's famous work right back to the very first edition, seen here in the British Library. Printed by his brother Benjamin, this beautifully illustrated text was the product of the highly literate White family. And to understand more about Molly's role in this family, we need to keep turning the pages back to Gilbert's original manuscript, and back even further into the archives. So who was Molly White? How did she take care of Gilbert's manuscript? And what kind of letters tell us about the environment that shaped the natural history of Selborne? Well, by rereading Molly's letters now held in archives in the UK and the States, we're going to follow her life in late 18th century London. We'll find her at the British Museum, at the Royal Academy and at the theatre. But we'll also find her in the library, reading works from the 15th to the 18th century. And by following the trail from her letters to her uncle's book, we're going to find pressed into the pages of the Natural History of Selborne the very faintest traces of Molly's reading. This, then, is the cultural history of Selborne, told through the writings of the woman who helped shape Gilbert's pioneering book. Now, whilst some of Molly's letters have been available to read in print since the early 20th century, they were heavily edited by her great-nephew Rashleigh. So what better place for us to start than with Molly's own unedited account of her life? Written in 1814, 25 years after the Natural History of Selborne was first printed, Molly wrote a short account of her family for her surviving son and nephew. Now aged 55, she reflected on the Welsh origins of her mother's family and recorded the key events in her own life. Born in London on the 10th of December 1759 and baptised in a church just north of London Bridge, she was the eldest of 4 siblings. By the time of her 4th birthday, she had witnessed the birth and death of her sister Sarah and the death of their mother, Mary, from childbirth complications following the delivery of twin brothers, Tom and Harry, in 1763, which means that Molly grew up under the influence of her father and his brothers. And so to understand what that means for the history of her uncle's book, let's meet the people who shaped Molly's life. Her father, Thomas Holt White, was a Fellow of the Royal Society and published writings on Shakespeare and Milton. His brother Benjamin was the leading natural history publisher of his day, and their brother Gilbert was of course to become the best-selling author of the Natural History of Selborne. Keeping it in the family in 1785, 4 years before Selborne was published, Molly married her cousin, also called Benjamin, who worked in his father's publishing firm. And so what we can see here is a tight-knit, highly literate family, with Molly doubly related through birth and marriage to the people who wrote and printed Selborne. And we can understand far more about her life in this family environment and how it helped shape Selborne by reading Molly's letters to her brothers and her uncle Gilbert, but doing so takes us far from rural Hampshire, and instead finds Molly, her father and Uncle Benjamin in Lambeth, with a family printing firm not far away on Fleet Street in the City of London. And so as we start to explore their lives in this metropolis, we're going to paint a very different picture of the history of Selborne. Now, I haven't been able to locate exactly where Molly lived with her father in Lambeth, but one of Gilbert's letters tells us that their house was just south of the turnpike. So if we turn to a map of Lambeth from the mid-18th century, it's likely that Molly was living somewhere around here, near to the turnpike and close to St Mary's Church at the side of Lambeth Palace, where she and Benjamin married in June 1785. Given the family interest in botany and natural history, it's intriguing to wonder what Molly would make of her local church now being the home of London's Garden Museum. But we don't need to speculate about Molly's views on the London she did know, because her letters leave us with a lively record of her life and interests, and so as we follow her about town, we start to gain new insight into the cultural landscape that sits behind her uncle's work. So let's cross the Thames and travel to Somerset House in 1781, where we find her at the Royal Academy's summer exhibition. Telling her brother that there's a beautiful picture of the Three Lady Waldegraves by Sir Joshua Reynolds, and that the crowds mostly admire a new painting of a shepherd's boy by Thomas Gainsborough. Less to her taste in the same exhibition was the painting of the Sharp family by Johann Zoffany. I can't say it pleases me, Molly wrote to her brother Tom. She wasn't alone. A satirical pamphlet called The Earwig, or an Old Woman's Remarks on the Present Exhibition of Pictures of the Royal Academy, declared Zoffany's conversation piece to be abominable. Nevertheless, Molly clearly enjoyed the exhibition. By the time she wrote to Tom, she'd already been twice, and was planning to return again next time her brothers were in town. So Molly's letters, therefore, are starting to draw back the curtains on a different life lived by the White family in London than that of their country parson relative. Indeed, a year later, we find her at the theatre watching Sarah Siddons perform. She seems to not only feel herself every word she speaks, but makes the whole house do the same, Molly explained to her brother in November 1782. Fast forward another year, and she was reflecting on missing the performance of another famous actress, Frances Abington, in the Jacobean play Rule a Wife and Have a Wife, which some of her cousins had seen in a very crowded theatre on the night that the royal family had also attended. Indeed, so busy had the theatre been that night that Molly's future husband had hurt his hand trying to raise himself up to get a peep, as Molly puts it, at the royals. So why didn't Molly attend? Well, in her letter to Tom, she makes a light-hearted dig at him. Though, perhaps if I'd had a brother to take care of me, I might have been tempted to have gone, she writes. Family outings were clearly a favourite pastime for the Whites. 4 years earlier, she'd told Tom that we went a large party to the British Museum last Tuesday and were much entertained at the number of curious things we were shown, though I think it's not quite so amusing as Sir Ashton Lever's, where I went for the third time. So here we find Molly at Ashton Lever's Eclectic Museum in Leicester Square, which housed approximately 27,000 objects, ranging from Persian slippers to fossils and shells, and from spears and knives to birds' nests and seeds. And clearly Molly was amused by Lever's museum because she was on a third visit to it. Now, maybe that's unsurprising because another one of Molly's uncles, John White, was a friend of Lever's. But what was Molly finding so amusing? Well, the diary of the novelist Fanny Burney gives us more insight into the nature of Ashton Lever. On the 31st of December 1782, Burney recorded visiting the museum and meeting Lever. He may be an admirable naturalist, but I think if you leave the "ist" out, you'll not much wrong him. He looks full 60 years old, yet he had dressed not only 2 young men, but himself in a green jacket, a round hat with green feathers, a bundle of arrows under one arm, and a bow in the other, and thus, accoutred as a forester, he pranced about, Burney wrote about Lever. She wasn't entertained, but clearly Molly was. And so from Molly's letters we're starting to get a real sense of the cultural world she inhabited. We find her at plays, museums and exhibitions. And excitingly also at the first manned balloon flight in England. As Vincenzo Lunardi took to the skies in his balloon in September 1784, Molly was one of the thousands of spectators watching, alongside the Prince of Wales at the artillery ground in London's Moorfields, and Gilbert was at home waiting for news of it from his niece. So the impression we get of Molly from her letters is that of an intelligent, fun and curious young woman, interested in the theatre, art and natural history, but she's also an older sister. She chides her brothers for long silences and short letters, comments on their haircuts and clothes, and regales them with tales of her life in London. Returning from a trip to Greenwich in 1781, she even admits that she was tolerably sober, notwithstanding the champagne. But let's not dismiss Molly's letters simply as evidence of a life well lived. Instead, interspersed with these accounts of her cultural life, we can also find evidence of her reading a range of classical, medieval, early modern and contemporary texts. So let's turn the page again and find Molly in the family library, because it's here that we really start to understand why she was Gilbert's editor. Writing to her brother Tom in March 1784, she told him, "I'm reading a new publication that entertains me extremely. The title is Dramatic Miscellanies, consisting of critical observations on several plays of Shakespeare." She goes on to say, "Does not the title make you wish to see it? Pray endeavour if you can hire it, for I'm sure you'll be extremely delighted with it. There are 3 volumes." So reading Molly's recommendation today tells us that she was enjoying essays on the origins of Shakespeare's King John and the history of its revival in the 1730s, alongside accounts of the life of the actress Anne Hallam. So here we have Molly reading a book about literary and theatrical history. And really that's hardly surprising. We know that she enjoyed going to the theatre and that her father wrote articles about Shakespeare. So her reading seems entirely in keeping with what we know about her life. But what I think is more interesting is her recommendation of the book to her brother, because she's not the only family member to be corresponding on this book. Indeed, a week after Molly wrote to Tom, Gilbert also recommended the same book to a friend of his, and because Gilbert was in Lambeth staying with his brother at the time, I think we can assume that niece and uncle were reading the same copy of the book together. And this gives us insight into the habits of the White family. Molly and Gilbert's separate letters tells us that books were discussed and shared within the household, as well as being recommended further afield, and that the family shared the same literary tastes. And this is important for understanding Gilbert's relationship with his first editor. Uncle and niece read together and sent each other extracts of writing ranging from Milton's Samson Agonistes to essays in The Spectator. They read the same periodicals, commented on articles in the Gentleman's Magazine and the Monthly Review, and kept abreast of recent publications. The year before, Gilbert had asked Molly for information about how a newly printed edition of Horace by George Coleman had been critically received. And clearly Gilbert expected that Molly would be able to provide him with a summary of the book's reviews, which suggests that he knew his niece to be au fait with contemporary publishing. But what I think Gilbert's request also shows us is that Horace, along with Shakespeare, had cultural currency within the family. After all, Benjamin's printing firm was at the sign of Horace's head on Fleet Street, as this anti-slavery text that he printed in 1776 shows. And the family interest in Horace was obviously enduring. Gilbert had translated Horace in the late 1740s, whilst Molly's brother Tom cited Horace in a work he published on Milton in 1818. So what we're starting to sense here is that there are authors and books that have collective meaning and worth within the White family, and that Molly is definitely part of that familial reading circle. And there's certainly plenty more evidence that the family did indeed share actual books as well as a love of reading. The diary of another White brother, Molly's Uncle Henry, tells us that books were being sent to and from Fleet Street to Hampshire. Elsewhere, Molly's letters tells us that she had borrowed the poems of Oliver Goldsmith, which she'd long wished to read from her cousin, and that she was hoping that Tom had a book on the history of Oxfordshire that had somehow been misplaced within the family. In yet another letter, she asked him to check Percy's poems for a ballad she was interested in. Now this book was almost certainly Thomas Percy's Relics of Ancient English Poetry, and her request for Tom to check its contents reveals that Percy's collection of medieval and early modern poems had cultural currency within the family, as did Virgil's Georgics, Pope's Iliad and Thomson's The Seasons, all of which Molly and Gilbert corresponded with each other on. So in recreating Molly's reading habits and books from her letters, we're starting to build a picture of a family culture of intergenerational and sociable reading, where books and ideas were circulating between family members in London and Hampshire. And because it's captured by Molly's pen, and it's clear that she's reading these texts too, we can be certain that she shared the family literary tastes and was more than capable of holding her own against her brothers, uncles, cousins and fathers. And this matters when we explore how she helped produce her uncle's book, because we shouldn't imagine her involvement in the work to be simply that of her uncle's favoured niece and correspondent. Instead, we need to understand her to be a well-read, highly literate and culturally astute member of the family, whose research and editing skills helped shape Gilbert's book. And to understand what I mean by that, let's turn to a letter from December 1781. Agreeable to your request, Molly writes to Gilbert, I've written out the passages in Verstegan and Chaucer. Now here she's referring to an early Jacobean book and a 15th century poem once thought to be by the Canterbury Tales author. And what's interesting is that we can see how Gilbert used the passage from Verstegan in the Natural History of Selborne. So let's have a look at the 1605 text that Molly copies for Gilbert and compare it with this passage in her uncle's book from 1789. And what we can see is that Gilbert uses in his own book the information on Anglo-Saxon names for months taken by Molly from Verstegan. And this isn't the only time that Molly acts as a conduit of information to her uncle. Elsewhere, she copies information from a French antiquarian work printed in 1706 and sends it to Gilbert, and that also makes it into the Natural History of Selborne. This time it's a reflection on the origins of the word swine, and from her letter it's clear that she's passing on information that her father had copied, which gives us more insight into the collaborative practices that inform the production of Gilbert's book. Father, uncle and niece are accessing and reworking a number of sources to inform the writing of Selborne, and nowhere is it clearer how many sources are being used within this familial chain than a short sentence in Gilbert's book. Here he incorrectly names Robert Langland as the author of the 15th century poem Piers Plowman, and that information had come via Molly. But let's not blame her for this mistake. She'd referenced 5 different printed books dating from 1550 to 1781 in a letter to Gilbert, and that's hugely revealing, because in the breadth of the text she had access to, we can gain much greater insight into the works that are circulating within the White family. Just in this one short line we can see that they are engaging with and using medieval, Tudor, Stuart and Georgian texts, and that's all informing Gilbert's book via Molly's pen. So we're not just looking at natural historians, we're also looking at a family of antiquarians. No wonder Gilbert called Molly Sister Antiquary. She, like the men in her family, was actively involved in the pursuit and publication of knowledge. Which brings us back to the manuscript that she copy-edited for Gilbert. In the series of letters we can find her and her uncle and her father and husband corresponding on editing and proofing Gilbert's texts. More sources are checked, passages are removed and illustrations and typesetting are discussed. But this isn't new information. It's long been known that the production of Gilbert's book was a family enterprise. So why is it important to highlight Molly's role? Well, I think exploring the history of Selborne through Molly's pen offers us new insight into the family that produced this much-loved book. Reading her letters in their unedited form gives her back the quirky and lively voice that's missing from her great-nephew's volumes of Gilbert's letters. Her own words shape her life, populating it with the artists, actress and writers of the day who clearly were part of the social and cultural discourses that circulated within the White family. And that's why it's so important to hear the voice of this Georgian woman who worked in the print trade and who read and engaged with a huge range of texts, because her letters give us real insight into the White family's collaborative literary practices, how they read together and how they wrote and produced works together. So Molly's letters offer us different histories of Selborne. Piecing together her involvement in the research and editing of Gilbert's book reveals more of his sources. Reading her correspondence with family members expands our knowledge of how Gilbert's interests were intergenerational within his kinship network. And through her assessments of exhibitions, performances and poetry, Molly allows us to understand far more about the cultural ecosystem that equipped her to edit Gilbert's book. Because she was a reader of classical, medieval, early modern and Georgian texts. She read Milton and Shakespeare and antiquarian works on Anglo-Saxon names and monasteries. She visited museums, art exhibitions and the theatre, and witnessed England's first manned balloon flight. And so, through her writing, we can do so much more than just listening to family news. Instead, her letters enable us to explore her and her family's cultural landscape. And so, as we put her on the map of Georgian women book producers, we also uncover more of the origins of Gilbert's work, stretching from rural Hampshire to the streets, printing presses and bookcases of late 18th century London. And this is important, because if Gilbert's book is, as Virginia Woolf once wrote, a door left open through which we hear distant sounds, then Molly's letters are a door through which we can glimpse the distant sights of Selborne's interior cultural landscape. And therefore it seems an appropriate tribute to the woman who helped form and nurture his book to rediscover her in Gilbert's tercentenary year. After all, he called Molly Sister Antiquary, and so it's fitting that through her writings we gain new insight into the cultural history of Selborne.